Welcome. I'm Dr. Ray Swan, host of the Understanding Boys podcast. Over the last 3 years, we've had something like 50,000 downloads across 14 countries. People just like you, interested in the development and growth of healthy young boys. I'm a father, I'm a teacher, I'm someone who grew up experiencing firsthand the difficulty of traditional masculine norms. I lost a friend in my youth to suicide and experienced firsthand the devastating impact of early childhood trauma. As host of Understanding Boys, I've spent the last 3 years interviewing lots of different people from walks of life, hours of research looking at what is it to be a good man these days. And with fellow researchers, I've spent time looking at not only what's happening for our boys, but what can we do. In this webinar this evening, you're going to find out about what we've been learning about, hear from international experts, as well as gain a clear picture of what you can do for your boys right now. You know, whenever we post something on social media or in Understanding Boys, we get a range of different experiences and different voices in that space. Some saying we shouldn't treat boys differently. Some saying there's nothing wrong with masculinity. But whatever your voice is, please know it's welcome. We want to involve you in a conversation because, as a colleague once said to me, one of our most intimate experiences of self begins with gender, and we need to have a robust discussion. Before we start, let's take a moment to acknowledge the land on which this webinar is being projected out on, the Boonwurrung people of the Kulin Nation, and we pay respects to their elders past, present and emerging, and extend that respect to any First Nations people here this evening. So, let's have a look at what it's like to be a boy right now. Our boys start life full of openness and wonder. But at around ages 4 and 5, things start to change. They receive messages about what it is to be a man these days. And we need to pay attention. We need to pay attention not because there's anything wrong with being male, but left unchecked, when boys form narrow views of what it is to be a man, it can actually hinder their self-expression. It can impact on their ability to form close relationships or worse. But there is good news. There are things that we can do. So there are a number of factors in developing a healthy, positive sense of masculinity, and it would seem that some of these are both biologically as well as socially determined. But where does it all start? You know, it's fascinating. If you ask boys as young as 4 and 5, they actually have a pretty good idea. We spoke with Judy Chu, Stanford researcher, global head of research for Movember, author of When Boys Become Boys, from season 1 on our podcast. She talks about boys as relational beings, the decisions that they make about how to fit in, how to be a man, and left unchecked, the terrible impact that these decisions can have.
Thanks very much, Ray. So in my studies of boys during early childhood, what really struck me was their relational capabilities. Infant studies have long shown that, all people are born with a fundamental capacity and a primary desire for close, emotionally intimate connections. And what I found with these 4-year-old boys when I entered their lives was that they were very much, wearing their hearts on their sleeves, so to speak. They were very open, very honest. What you saw was what you got, and they were just, what I found them to be was articulate and direct and authentic and attentive. They were all, charming in their own way because they just were so genuine and so interested in relating to other people, really motivated to kind of connect with people in meaningful ways. And what was significant about looking at them at this age was they were also beginning to enter schools, spending more time, among their peers and learning what might be new rules about what it means to be a boy. Sometimes it was the same as what they were learning from their families, but sometimes it was, for instance, if their families were more open-minded about, what boys and girls and, people of all gender could do, these boys were learning that, in the classroom, to be a boy meant, you like to play with guns, or you like to run around during the recess, times, or girls were supposed to play with dolls and boys weren't supposed. So they learned these kind of rules of their group, peer group culture, and they definitely align with them because they want to fit in, they want to belong, they want to be recognized as one of the boys and accepted for those reasons. And so early childhood was an interesting window into a period of transition where you could at the same time see their relational capabilities openly on display, but you could also see how they were very strategically and in many ways with much savvy and wisdom, adapting their behavior so that they could kind of navigate their social situations successfully. Um, One of the things that I wanted to point out, though, was that in following these boys over the course of the year, as they began to be more adept at aligning with the kind of cultural and group norms of masculinity, was that it started to become more difficult to detect their relational capabilities. So whereas they had been very forthright in being articulate, direct, authentic, and attentive, they began to kind of posture more. They began to present themselves in ways that made them appear inarticulate, indirect, inattentive, and inauthentic. Or, in other words, they began to look more like stereotypical boys or the way boys are often said to be. And this might contribute to why, in general, boys' relational capabilities tend to get overlooked and underestimated. Not only because, first of all, we as adults who are observing them we tend to find what we look for. If we don't expect to see boys' relational capabilities, it can be easy to miss, right? So we don't notice when the boys are snuggly and cuddling or very sweet, but when they are, running around, we say, oh, look, boys will be boys, or that, all the boys are doing this. So what the things that we tend to notice and attune to tend to be influenced by our own conceptions of what boys are like, but also because of this transition that coincides with a shift in their relational presence as the boys begin to cultivate a public persona in light of or in response to what they think people expect of boys and therefore expect of them. They learn also to kind of cover up their relational capabilities, particularly in cultures and societies that tend to associate emotions and relationships and being attuned to people and being really interested and excited about interacting. When we associate those things with femininity, and when we define femininity and masculinity as mutually exclusive opposites, then boys come to recognize that to display those quote unquote feminine qualities will jeopardize their masculinity or their ability to prove their masculinity or establish their masculine identity. So in essence, what we deem as feminine weaknesses, which are in fact actually human strengths, boys learn that if they don't cover those up, those become liabilities for boys in their quest to kind of show that they are real boys or one of the boys. And while that's very much socially adaptive, there's also a psychological and relational cost because ironically, although they're motivated to align with these social conventions by a genuine desire to connect with other people, when they align in these, when they kind of feel compelled to become something else or something more in order to be accepted in those relationships and interactions, it actually hinders their ability to engage with other people in meaningful ways. It makes it harder for them to bring themselves fully into relationship and to genuinely engage with other people in the ways that lead to developing in what researchers have identified as protective relationships that have been shown to protect against both psychological risks like low self-esteem and depression, or even social risks like dropping out of school, becoming involved with gangs, using substances, alcohol, drugs, all those things. I mean, so really they found that the single best protector is really helping boys and all individuals actually to preserve their connections to themselves in the sense of their sense of integrity and their connection to others in the sense of their relationships, which of course, those two things, their connection to self and to others, are interdependent, right? And so our ability to be fully present in relationships depends on our relationships, the quality of our relationships, and our ability to develop healthy protective relationships depends on how we present ourselves within those interactions and with others. So the good news though is that although boys do shift their relational capabilities in ways that can make it more difficult for them to engage with others and for others to engage with them, which ultimately can lead to loneliness and anxiety as adults, the good news is that throughout the life course, boys and later men continue to seek connections and resist disconnections. And so some of the things that we recognize, as problematic behaviors, you can, if you look at it through a relational lens, you can see that an underlying motivation is really that desire to be known and to be accepted, to feel validated and supported. And but it's just that society, because societal definitions of masculinity may have place certain constraints, so they can't have access, they can't utilize the full range of human skills and qualities that would help them get those things. And so sometimes it goes askew, right? So again, like their intention is to preserve a sense of them, preserve and be known for a version of themselves that feels honest and whole. But because their hands are bound in a way, I mean, as it is with any definition of gender that says, oh, there's what that implies that there is one right or best way to be, it makes it very difficult for anyone to enter into their interactions and relationships as themselves. And so, but the like I said, the good news about their resistance and resilience is it shows that they continue to be interested, they continue to be invested in being known, and they continue to also grasp on any opportunity to be recognized as they see themselves. They really, that capacity and desire that the infant researchers observed really carries forward, and we have this innate ability to detect when we're not getting authenticity and reciprocity in our relationships. So I think that's really the dilemma of why we may not recognize the urgency and importance of really paying attention to boys, because they can look like they're doing fine. The socialization messages and pressures put them on a trajectory so that they appear to display the qualities that are familiar to us, but may misrepresent or kind of underestimate the full range of relationship abilities that they're capable of. And so one of the things that we can do as parents and as educators is to really join them in, first of all, join them where they are, and to kind of, value them as they are instead of for what they do. And to really recognize, for instance, that they are, who they are, but also in general, vulnerable, just like anyone else. I think in our society, there's a huge tendency to somehow inadvertently consider boys and men almost like robots, like, oh, they hurt them, they break their arm, they're supposed to, just walk it off, or somebody that they really cared about, broke up with them and they're just supposed to get over it. So we really don't fully acknowledge the importance of relationships for boys and men. And that's much to their detriment, because they learn that they also cannot kind of admit to how important their emotions are, how important their relationships are. And again, that can lead them down the line to kind of shut down or to feel like they can't share. And that can become very tragic, actually, in terms of their health outcomes. And again, there are studies to support how they can impact not only their mental health, but also their physical health. So if we can identify kind of these moments of transition during their development and support them in ways that can help them hold on to and preserve, the things that will actually, the human strengths, the relational capabilities and human strengths that will actually ultimately serve them well, as friends, as partners, as leaders, so both professional as well as personal roles that they may take on in life, we really give them the kind of advantage that balances, what we want for them, which is to both be able to be successful in what they do and also happy in their lives.
So as we look at the research into gender and health, there are still a few more things to think about. Let's cross now to Associate Professor Dr. Simon Rice from Oregon about his research and work in understanding adolescent male mental health. In this, we'll explore some of the other things that are at play for our boys as they develop into healthy adults.
Thank you, Ray. So I've been working in the field of male mental health, men's mental health for the last 15 years. And when I first started in this area, my focus was really on men's experience of depression and the question around whether men experience the symptoms of depression in different ways, or perhaps a different collection of symptoms relative to women and other gender groups. That research question and exploring that has taken me into some really interesting areas. And now my interests are much broader than that and include the focus on the mental health of boys and young men. And one of the most encouraging things that I've seen over the 15 years that I've been working in this field has been the incredible growth, the explosion of researchers, of academics, people in the community, parents, schools, community groups interested in doing this work. I think there's a great recognition now that there are some gaps around the mental health of males, be that boys, young men, older men, and that we need to think in much more sophisticated ways in which how we're going to attack this problem, because it is a significant problem. It should come as no surprise that this notion that healthy men don't just appear at the age of 18 or 20 or 25. Health is a choice. The things that impact our health and influence our health are a set of choices, and we arrive at those set of choices through our experiences, through our early years. We really want to be thinking about giving boys and young men the best opportunity to be able to make healthy choices as they enter young adulthood and older adulthood, because those experiences are really going to set them up. And when we're talking about health, we're talking broadly mental health, physical health, and relationships being key to anyone's psychosocial functioning. One of the key drivers around the mental health of boys and young men is the importance of social factors, of social isolation, of socialisation, and the way in which these social factors impact. So, one of the key aspects of this, as Judy Chu talked about, was this notion around boys and young men feeling like they need to cover up vulnerable emotions. And so often these vulnerable emotions are connected to a sense of femininity, and that so often is rejected by boys and young men. While that does have some social benefits, it can have some psychological and some health problems associated with it. And one of the things that we really need to be thinking about is giving boys and young men the experiences and the exposures to different ways of thinking so that they can be flexible in which times they choose to engage and disengage with gender norms and the way they can impact health behaviour. The statistics that we have are really sobering, and it's one of the key reasons why we need to be doing this work. There are many countries where there is fluctuation, but globally the rates of suicide are higher in the factor of 2 to 4 times for males and relative to females. So there's definitely something gendered in relation to this most extreme act of mental health problems and social problems around suicide. We also see much higher rates of substance use, violence and aggression, and by extension incarceration and imprisonment rates for younger men and men throughout the life course relative to other gendered groups. And again, I think we need to be thinking about what are the social drivers of some of these key problems. So when we think, what are some of the solutions that we can be implementing, I think we also need to be mindful that it's probably about developing a different kind of social and emotional engagement for young men and boys, both with their male peers, with girls and young women, with other gendered groups, because that's going to be key. Underneath all of this, we need to be doing work to support and validating the expression of emotion in young men and boys. There's a pretty thin kind of range of tolerated emotion, and on the most extreme end, it's somewhere between happiness and anger. But there's a whole gamut of wider emotions, and the expression of those wider emotions is an important part of the human condition. And we really need to challenge this notion that boys and men, young men, expressing vulnerable emotions should be considered as unmanly. While that is an idea that's held, I think it's going to be really hard for us to make a lot of progress in this area. So we need to be challenging that notion. And there's a lot of work that's been happening over the last decade and beyond, but we've got a way to go. Related to that sense of being perceived as unmanly if you're displaying vulnerable or soft or more feminine, stereotypically labelled emotions, is this idea that young males and boys are going to lose social status. So again, that can be a powerful driver of boys and young men not wanting to put up their hand to seek help, not wanting to talk and connect with their peers when they're feeling like they might need support. And so these are things and ideas that we need to challenge in ways that are going to be acceptable to males. I think part of this is also understanding and ensuring that young men and boys have a good sense of the diversity of gender identity and gender roles and emotional expression within the community. And that will be a powerful driver also supporting the mental health of those who don't necessarily align with dominant norms of masculinity or what it is to be a young man or a boy. I think also we have to make sure that some of this work, or all of this work, needs to avoid any shaming responses. We hear a lot about toxic masculinity, and I think there's probably a bit of an understanding around the kind of embodiment of toxic masculinity and the kind of characteristics that toxic masculinity shows and is connected to. But I worry sometimes that use of that term is going to disengage the group that we're seeking to engage most. We're wanting to look after and support young men and boys in the broadest sense. And I think anything that we do to label masculinity as toxic, even though there can be a sense of some behaviours clearly are toxic, can be problematic and alienating. So making sure that we're not engaging in shaming responses is going to be key to that. I think what we can also do is really support and honour and leverage the bravery and the courage and, their kind of, prized masculine norms, traditional masculine norms. So honouring the bravery and courage of those boys and young men who reject harmful norms and stereotypes and challenge those, and then make sure that these are considered to be key role models within our community. Lots of ways that we can be doing this work, and schools provide a really opportune place. But schools also need to be mindful about supporting parents, because parents are key, and students aren't just at school, they're also with their family and the wider community, and we need to be very mindful of the different levels of factors that are influencing the mental health of boys and young men, especially when it comes to gender norms and masculinity.
Thank you, Simon, and we'll cross back to Simon shortly on the panel. So let's think about you and the dreams and stories and visions that you have and the things that you had as you were growing up. What was it that you looked at to give yourself this healthy sense of your own life? And think about the kinds of stories that we're telling our kids right now. What are the images that they see of their superheroes in the movies? Are they the heroes that we once saw, values-driven, doing the right thing for all humankind? Or are they broken and corrupted and twisted, often presenting very dark images of ways of being? Think too of technology that's meant to be making us feel more connected. Yet research is showing that technology is actually making us feel more alone and more disconnected from each other. Think also of pornography and the unfettered access that many boys have to pornography through devices that they feel are very much personalised. It really is a difficult time to be a boy and to be growing up. So we know that there's a problem. And a lot of work has gone into defining the problem. But we think it's time now to look at some solutions. What can we do? What are some positive and proactive steps that we can take as a community to really enable our boys to grow into healthy young men? Well, through Understanding Boys, we've done a few things with the generous support of the John and Elaine King Foundation, with Brighton Grammar, and also with Origin, the Centre for Youth Mental Health. Firstly, we undertook an enormous review, a systematic review of all of the research to look at what's out there, what's working and what's not. Secondly, we developed a framework. The framework is what I'm going to show you this evening. It's something simple that we can all use and start to think about to provide the guideposts, to provide some guidelines for us as parents. And thirdly, we're looking to continue to build this community, to provide you with resources that you can access to help you on your journey as a parent and guardian. So let's talk now with Professor Matt Engler-Carlson from Fullerton, the Centre for Men and Boys, about what it means to take a positive approach to raising boys and young men.
Thanks, Ray. Let me start by talking a bit about kind of my history with this work and kind of where this idea of positive masculinities kind of comes from. We have 40 to 50 years of empirical research looking at the psychology of men and masculinities, probably a lot more than people are aware of. And a short version for me is that I've been working in the field of kind of men and masculinities for over 20 years. When I first got engaged in this field, I was voracious in doing reading. I read cross-discipline. I read everything I could possibly read because I was really concerned about helping men lead healthier lives. And the work, honestly, came a bit easy for me. I always found that it was easy to connect with men, and as a boy or as an adult. so I really thought this was a wonderful thing. But after some time, I began to be a bit concerned that we were only looking at the unhealthy side of men, which is honestly not that uncommon, since the mental health field is often really about mental illness. We have the DSM, which catalogs all the things that go wrong. We don't necessarily have a book that catalogs all the things that go right. So I began to question whether some of the things I was reading and learning about described the men that I knew and the boys that I knew, or kind of captured my boyhood. And I wasn't alone with that. Along with some colleagues, Mark Koselica, Mark Stevens in particular, I think in the United States, we began to have these open conversations about, again, we're really capturing the full range of men's lives. Again, we had this idea where things went wrong, but we weren't really sure about how professionals had a guidepost in terms of kind of how to help their male clients, for example, be healthy men. We began to talk about and write about what potentially could look like in terms of ideas of what a healthy blueprint might be. And this idea of kind of healthy masculinities is still surprisingly new. But again, it's something that people are drawn to. Because again, we do understand a lot of the ways in which maybe masculinities or gender role norms kind of straitjackets men's lives and boys' lives. And so what we're all really looking for is this path out of that. And I think that's where kind of positive masculinities rests. And the reality is there is some aspects in terms of what I would say is that, you know when you see it, if that makes sense. But I think the interesting about this is this movement away from is healthy masculinity is not necessarily the same thing as maybe being a healthy human, right? Meaning that I think we are putting a gender lens on this because society puts a gender lens on us. We begin to kind of say, again, what does it mean to be a healthy boy? What does it mean to be a healthy man? And I do think sometimes for parents, again, I'm a parent of a 17-year-old boy, and I've constantly asked myself, kind of who do I want my son to be? And it's, of course, easy for me to say kind of happy and healthy. What does that actually kind of mean? And, I think I'm fortunate enough to know what the research says. And the research says, again, that happy people have good relationships, right? We know in terms of men that happy men are adaptive, meaning that they are flexible in their environment. We know that happy and healthy men who live longer ask for help. And so again, I began to think about kind of what are these things in which we do in which we can help kind of boys lead healthier lives. So I think positive masculinity, again, is looking at kind of how do we look at assets that boys have or men have. Again, again, these are human attributes, right, that all people kind of have. However, we do live in a gendered society, right? So social norms do encourage kind of aspects around being a boy. And so again, we can look at kind of what are those assets and strengths that boys can kind of have, and then how do we actually utilize them to help men and boys have healthier lives. So I'd go back and kind of say what that kind of means again is, again, I don't want to get caught up into this thing like we know what it means to be unhealthy, right? But we are pretty sure we know in terms of what it means to be healthy too, and how do we apply that. So I would say again, this aspect around how we are flexible, right? That we want to teach kind of boys to look at other options and not be so rigid, which is hard because society often wants to put boys in very, very rigid places. Help seeking, right? So help seeking is something as an adult, which means going to a doctor. It means actually asking for directions. As a boy, it means asking help of your teacher, or willing to ask help of a peer or of a friend, and not have that somehow make you less of a boy or a man. Having good friendships and having good relationships. I think that it's surprisingly to me that we don't teach this as much in school, but we should. We should look at kind of what does it mean to be a healthy partner? What does it mean to be a healthy friend? I think conflict resolution is important. Boys are often kind of steered into conflict resolutions in certain ways. And sometimes that means being violent or being aggressive or only having anger. But the reality is that there are many other ways to do that. We don't necessarily want people to be conflict avoidant, right? Because I think that has its own problems. We want to help boys understand how we can kind of solve kind of conflicts in a more healthy, proactive way. And the last thing I would say is that also, how do we help boys have a sense of self that is related to themselves? and not necessarily related to all the things around them that say this is who you're supposed to be. There's plenty of kind of media and marketing out there that kind of points the ways that we think boys and men ought to be. But that isn't necessarily the same thing as what it means to be healthy. I think sometimes that means that as parents, we have to again look at kind of the models that our boys kind of have, expose them to other ones, right? And that can be really hard because as parents, of course, I grew up in an environment which I was fed the same thing and I saw the exact same things. And so if in order for me to be more gender aware with my son, I honestly have to be a lot more gender aware with myself. I think all of this for parents means, again, taking what we would call a growth mindset, right? Which is a term that we use a lot, which is we have these opportunities in which we work with our children and with our sons. And we want to look at the assets that are kind of there when maybe things don't go the way we would like, or maybe when potentially mistakes happen. We look at these as opportunities, right? Which can lead to conversations, which can lead to, again, with my son, they don't always lead to conversations. Often it just leads to acceptance, right? Acceptance and support and validation for kind of how he's feeling. And then later, maybe some type of conversation that we kind of have.
Thanks very much, Matt. Let's now take a look at the framework. And there are two parts. Firstly, there's knowing. So knowing is about building up knowledge. It's about experiences. It's about values and understandings. Ultimately, it leads to wisdom. So here's the thing about wisdom. Society has changed. You know, the way in which we grew up, the conversations that we had around the dinner table, the societal structures that we all pretty much took for granted have really changed. Our boys don't receive that information in the same way anymore. And the thing is that we need to teach them. We need to teach them about consent. We need to teach them about how to form values, what to believe in, what's really important. And to support you on this, we have an enormous amount of resources that we can share with you. Position papers to talk about sleep, technology, about teaching consent and so on. And they're a fantastic way for you to build your understandings as parents and guardians. And they're free. So how do you build knowing in the home? Well, I think there's three keys. Firstly, boys need to know that they're loved and cared for. That there's lots of different ways to be a boy. And importantly, that they're not shamed by their expressions of who they are. Secondly, they need to know that they have their feelings, that their feelings are okay, that there's a safe place for them. One of the great psychologists looking at this field, Steve Budoff, would say about boys, be careful with their tender feelings. We need to embody that sense in them about self-care, that they can be kind to themselves and ultimately that they know that they can be kind to others. And thirdly, we need to start early. We need to teach them about establishing boundaries, about rules, and what rules mean, how they both enable others to participate fairly, but they also provide a protective measure for people in society to be able to participate freely and to sense that feeling of belonging that we all desire and crave. Teach your son about values. Teach him what it's important to believe in and make time for that in your everyday life. So let's explore the being qualities in the framework. And there are three: being connected, being authentic, and being motivated. And we see these as really healthy expressions of positive masculinity. In terms of being connected, the truth is that boys have deep feelings. As we heard from Judy, they learn to push these feelings aside because they believe that to be able to fit in, they need to change the way that they connect to others. But what we need to teach our boys and what we need to value and acknowledge in them, that for boys, it's actually worth emotionally investing in relationships. The second quality is being authentic. And essentially being authentic is being comfortable in your own skin. We want to be a witness to the good that our sons are becoming. In season 3 of our podcast, we were able to interview Daniel Petrie, author of Father Time. And in his book, he talks about creating time to actually be a witness to the young man that your son is becoming. For your son to feel authentic, he needs to feel safe at home. You need to listen and to model this. And to be flexible, as Matt Engler-Carlson was saying a little bit earlier. And the third area is motivation. It's so important for our sons to feel like they have value in the world, to let them drive themselves into making connections, as we talked about, in being connected and being authentic, but we also want them to have a sense of motivation. And through that motivation, to know that, you know what, life can be challenging. We do need to persist. We do need to build resilience. Having an understanding of how to set goals, how to achieve them, and you know what, when sometimes things don't go to plan, that you do need to make adaptations and ask for help, is such a key part of building a healthy young boy. And I would ask you, do you know your son's goals? Do you know what matters to him? And do you know what direction he's hoping he's going to be able to take his life? So, we've covered a lot of ground and no doubt you've got many questions. So let's cross now to our panel.
Well, thank you everyone for your patience and your listening. We're going to open up for some questions down at the bottom of your screen. You can see there's the Q&A function as we go through. And just as we do get started, I'd like to welcome my fellow panelists to Kylie King, Dr. Kylie King, a Senior Research Fellow at the Turner Institute. Welcome. She works in suicide prevention, has a clinical background, is involved in evaluating a number of programs, and also, of course, Simon Rice, who is someone we heard from earlier, obviously, but someone who's really a leader for us in operationalising positive masculinity. Firstly, Kylie, I might ask you, we've had some questions coming through about helping boys to respond to the idea that masculinity in itself is bad. I'm just reading some of the comments. I'm interested in helping my son deal with feelings of generalised guilt about simply being male. Another person has written, how do you respond to claims that masculinity is toxic? Kylie, what are your thoughts about the term toxic masculinity, how it impacts boys, and what can parents do?
It's a big one, Ray. You've started us on the big question, but it's a pressing one, isn't it? Because it's in the media, we hear about it all the time. And Simon, you touched on it earlier when you were talking then. And I agree with Simon. I don't like the term toxic masculinity. I don't use it in my work or my research. I think it is alienating of men generally, and it's particularly the men that we really want to be talking to about these issues. And it does convey that idea that masculinity is all bad, when of course it's not. And I think generally there's a bit of a confusion between sort of the social pressures and norms that we call masculinity, and then a personally defined and lived masculinity. And so I guess in my research and with my boys at home, I talk about the social pressures around masculinity, the unwritten rules around masculinity. And we've talked about those already, about, you know, bottling up your feelings and acting as if everything's fine, not reaching out for help. And I guess when we think about toxic masculinity, we also talk about, you know, negative attitudes towards women. And so as I talk to my kids about that, and in my research, I talk about how that can have negative impacts for people, and sometimes for the people around men as well. But I think it's important to remember and to talk to our boys also about how lots of men are choosing not to live this type of masculinity, and how there are a lot of men that really want a different world and that are living a different masculinity, and also want it to be different for younger boys and men. And so that boys and men these days, you know, with that knowledge, can choose to be the sort of man that they want to be. So I think that's important, to give our boys insight into the pressures that they experience.
And that's the really good news, I think, as well, that there is, you know, as I think as Judy was saying, you know, that desire to connect and to maintain and build those connections as well. It's fantastic. Simon, we're getting a lot of questions about technology, and we heard in the webinar about technology. It's very topical at the moment. Obviously, lots of, if you're tuning in Australia, lots of parts of Australia, obviously in lockdown. We know that technology is an enabler in some ways, but we also know, as we said earlier, that it can actually isolate us, as well as a whole lot of other areas. Parents have written in things like, you know, how do we stay on top of the online worlds that boys inhabit, you know, watching hours of YouTube ourselves, staying on top of technology. From your perspective, Simon, what are some of the guidelines that we could recommend for parents and boys in regards to technology use in developing healthy masculinities?
A broad point to make there, Ray, is that increasingly young people see very little difference between their offline and their digital worlds. They're really kind of combining and coalescing more and more. And technology companies or software companies, whether it's social media, streaming apps, YouTube, Instagram, These companies, these organisations have phenomenal resources to invest in making their sites attractive and sticky, so that there's an element of addiction almost in driving boys and young men back to them. And that can be a good thing if those powers are used for good, but it can also be a problematic thing. And we're hearing more and more about this phenomenon of nomophobia, so no mobile phone phobia, and a huge proportion of the community, regardless of age, endorse having some fear, some anxiety about not having access to their phone. So I think it's something that is relevant and salient to all of us in the technology that's on offer. A sub-element of this is porn, and I think porn raises some really interesting challenges for young men and boys. And what we're seeing is the rapid increase in fetishization of porn. It's becoming much more aggressive, much more exploitative, much more demeaning than it was 15 years ago, 25 years ago, and much more readily available. And that's problematic if that becomes the perceived norm, obviously, for boys and young men thinking that that's what is expected of them. But I think one of the pathways out of this is for young men and boys to actually get a sense that, the porn industry is making this stuff, 99% of this stuff, for it to be addictive, and then that can impact behaviour. And I think it's also important for them to recognise that as an industry, the porn industry has no interest in the health of their relationships. The industry just wants to make money. So if they get a sense that they're kind of being played here, and that some of these sites or behaviours might have problematic impacts for their own behaviour and their own relationships, that might actually shift their own insight and their awareness to change behaviour.
One of the things that's coming through a little bit in the flavour of some of the comments and also some of the questions that were sent in earlier, and I might direct this one again to you, Kylie. Simon made a comment earlier about, the bandwidth of emotions. One parent writing in, how do we best encourage our boys to explore a range of emotions rather than defaulting to anger? And Simon's point about those too narrow, or the extremities in the emotional range at times. I mean, we want boys to be more emotionally available, but Kylie, how do we help our boys to be have a greater range of emotions that they're able to easily express, or more easily express?
Yeah, it's a fantastic question. I must say I struggle with this with my own kids as well. So I'm learning as I go along. But in the research that I've done with men, one of the things that became quite apparent to us is that what seems to happen is, because there's this pressure on men and boys to act like everything's okay and not show if they're struggling, then it kind of gives the impression to every other man and boy that everyone else is okay and no one else is struggling. And so one of the things we found in our interventions is that kind of increased awareness around other people's struggle was a huge breakthrough for a lot of people. So I think when we're thinking about raising healthy boys, I think a lot of it can come back to modeling our own emotional experience to our boys as well, and letting them know and showing our feelings when we might be feeling, sad or worried, or letting them see the full range of emotion in ourselves. So I think that's really important through that modeling, and then they can start to have permission to show those feelings themselves as well. And then I think the other thing I wanted to mention too was around anger, because I think, people get really scared about boys being angry. And I think it's also important to let boys know that anger, that it's okay to feel angry, that everyone feels angry, but it's about how you express that anger and what you do with it.
Yeah, making that difference is so important, isn't it, for boys, and that they can actually feel things, but also they don't necessarily have to, enact them in ways that are really harmful as well. We're getting a few questions here about programs at school level and what should schools be doing, and how can schools be working. And of course, that's something that if you are a school and you're interested to learn more about this work, please do contact us. I'd make a couple of very brief comments. Firstly, for schools to do this sort of work really well, you need obviously students involved, but you certainly need the teachers and also parents. So I think schools are doing this kind of work well, have those three things talking to each other and talking really well to each other. Just a very quick story. A number of years ago at Brighton Grammar, where I work, we brought in a coaching program. And the idea of the program was how do we listen to these young men? How do we listen to what they have to say and what their experience is? How do we know where they get help? And so we brought a coaching program in, which is essentially a listening program, really, where an adult will sit with a child and go through a process, a structured process, to listen really to their goals. And I noticed there's a few questions coming out about goals, and I think a big part of goal setting actually is in us as adults in listening. But the reason I wanted to share this story was, it's going back a few years now. I remember, we took all the classes and put them on hold, and we said, this is something that we're really passionate about and that we really believe in. And there was a lot of doubt. There was doubt amongst the teaching staff and the parents. What were the acceptability like? People were saying things like the boys won't turn up, and they'll treat it as a day off and so on. But what we know from the data is we actually had more kids there than any other day at school, less absenteeism. And on that day, there were literally hundreds of stories told. And the fascinating thing that I found about it, as I heard anecdotally, was there were certainly stories about wanting to improve and get better grades, but there were so many stories about wanting more friends or wanting to connect to other people in more meaningful ways. And that was really such a driver, and it was such a big lesson for me in particular, but I think also for all of us as a school community. A few questions in terms of, parenting. And, guys, you're both, Kylie, you're sharing a few thoughts about, role modelling as a parent, and Simon as well as a parent. What are some of your broad comments around parenting and in involving, the evolution of kids? I know, this is a conversation, I can see Kylie give me a smile. It's a tough game, parenting. It's very humbling. But I'd love to hear from both of you, just some of your general thoughts about what you're learning as parents and what might be some guideposts around enabling positive masculinity as parents.
I think one of the things that the positive masculinity model, a real strength that it lends to this particular question, Ray, is around authenticity. And we heard Matt Engler-Carson talking very clearly around the importance of authentic communication. And boys and young men have very finely tuned crap detectors, so they know when things are being said to them that may not necessarily be fully true or fully authentic. And it might be the case that, you want to impart some wisdom, but you don't feel comfortable as a parent talking about some of the mistakes that you've made, and there might be very good reasons for that. But that might be where there's a great role for a mentor, someone in your community, a trusted friend, family member, another adult who might be able to have an authentic conversation. And there's lots of environments where this can happen. It could be in a structured workshop facilitated by many of the great people who are doing this positive masculinity type work now in the community and providing a space for that. But it could be on a long drive somewhere where you're shoulder to shoulder with the young fella in your life and having an open conversation. So I think, those opportunities for authenticity are just so important. And they, as Matt said, they promote connection and they promote understanding.
That's great, Simon. I was just, as you were talking, I was thinking about another piece of advice that I got as a parent that I found really helpful, and that was separating the behaviour from the child. I think sometimes, in terms of that, our assemblages, when our kids grow up, they see us, Simon, and I know with your little one, maybe still seeing you as a deity, a great figure. I know for mine, they've certainly grown out of that period. But separating the person from the behaviour is so important, that you can talk about the behaviour and the impact of the behaviour. And I think, particularly for boys, slowing it down a little bit in the sense of what is the effect of who you are and the way in which you're interacting with others can be so vital. And it reminds me also, we talked a little bit about in the webinar, of the work of Daniel Petrie in creating time, like really available time that's not just whether it's walk alongside, but they're actually scheduling in time for our kids to really genuinely be seen. Kylie, what are some of your thoughts?
I've had a lot more thoughts as you've both been talking, but I was just thinking what Simon said about sharing mistakes, and it can be quite challenging, can't it? But I think it doesn't have to be anything really huge and controversial or any of your most embarrassing moments, but even just sometimes to be saying like, gee, when I was your age, I used to really stress out about friendships, or I was always worried about school, or, to share some of your emotional experiences as a younger person, I think can be really helpful. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. And how real that can be. We've done work here, and lots of the people allied to this work do that, just actually setting up conversational structures, and the comment I was making earlier about, we're growing up in a different world, and some of those conversational or dialogical structures, if you like, that we sort of had at the dinner table kind of disappeared. And how much you learn by, being available to those times and seeing other adults talk and share, and work through those, through those various challenges with humility. We are actually at time. It's seems to have gone quite quickly. All of a sudden, there are, just before we wrap, just a few thank yous that I would like to make. Firstly, to John and Elaine King from the King Foundation. Boy, if you had said a few years ago that we'd be doing this work and that we'd have nearly 1,500 people, interested in coming to this webinar, it just, I think, shows us just how important this conversation is. And I know John and Elaine's work and their support of this sort of work in terms of people, not buildings, for the way in which they like to interact with the community, I think it's been amazing. To obviously to Simon, to Origin, to your work, to E&S Trading for the donations to make their website that's coming on board happen, to the Change Within Foundation sponsoring a book, to Ross Featherston, Brighton Grammar, to Emily and the marketing team here, to Leah, and so many of the people that have really gone into making this webinar happen and this research happen, to Michael Wilson, to Kate Wyther. There are so many people whose lives have really positively impacted this work and this conversation. To my panelists, to you, Simon and Kylie, thank you for everything that you do and your availability. And finally, to all of you that have given up your Monday evening to tune in, we hope you stay engaged. This is an important conversation. I think we are breaking new ground. I encourage you to follow along to Understanding Boys, because at the end of the day, that's why we're here. We're here for our kids, to help them grow into the young men that we need for this age. So that's it for this evening. Until next time we speak, thanks again.